Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I'm happy to be reconnecting with Brian Lamb, one of the founders of Swivl, after nearly a decade. Brian's work focuses on the crucial, often overlooked side of educational technology, reflection, and feedback. And we use that as an opportunity to talk about related things like the critical difference between being data-driven and data-informed, the impact of gaming culture and the gamification of digital interfaces, even in assessment, on students' ability to decenter and engage with the complexities of reality, and how that perhaps contributes to our increased tribalism. How to balance knowledge building with perspective taking, and the value of using AI as a thought partner to cultivate what Brian calls uncomputable intelligence, rather than letting technology simply drive our practice. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional learning options. Our PBL Grow 26 Summer Professional Learning event is in the early bird registration pricing stage through the end of February, and we're filling up fast. We also have several online course options for PBL and differentiated instruction, and our AI PBL design tool that we've created in collaboration with Inquire. We're looking forward to a busy spring and summer, and please feel free to reach out to me via the request more info form at wegrowteachers.com or directly at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Now here's my conversation with Brian Lamb, available in both audio and video on our YouTube channel. I am with Brian Lamb, and excited to talk with him about several things. It's been quite a few years. I was looking back, it was 2017 when we last talked, and that seems like several lifetimes ago. It was certainly a name change. We were Teach Thought PD at that point. It was the Teach Thought podcast. Now we're Thought Stretchers Education. We have gone back and forth several exchanges on Twitter about interesting things and the work that you do. But I'm going to give you the opportunity to reintroduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about the work that you have been doing since 2017. Man,
it's crazy. Cool. Well, thanks for this opportunity. It's really great to reconnect. For those of you that don't know, I'm one of the founders of the company Swivl. We're most known for, at least initially, was tools to observe teachers on video and give them a chance to reflect on their practice and improve. And it fit into lots of different school improvement and implementation plans. Ever since then, we've been tinkering with different technology formulas to help teachers reflect better and students reflect better. And I think we've been a bit of a unusual edtech company, if you'd even call us an edtech company itself, because everybody else focuses on engagement. We tend to focus on the other side of things, which is feedback and tools to help people reflect better and be better. And I think, to me, there's a real intention behind that we can explore. But that's really what we're doing. And now our latest tool set, we call it M2, but there's tools that bring AI into classroom to observe and give feedback to teachers, and then generate reflective experiences for students to do after the fact.
Yeah, I'm curious. EdTech is getting a bad name right now. I had Jared Cooney Horvath on. I think maybe I was one of the first, if not the first, to have him on just as his new book is hitting, and he has made certainly made a splash, and he's talking about how educational technology has been, in his measures, detrimental to student learning. Curious how that's affected your work and how you think about that.
Well, I've read this book, and I think it's a great book. I think it's an important contribution, and it's an important conversation. I wouldn't say it's directly affected us yet in any way, partly because of what we do is different, right? We really are, in more ways than one, a teacher-centric tool than a student-centric tool, although we do some things for students. But I think because of that, it's a different category when it comes down to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah. But I think it's for me, it's an overdue conversation, because I think the way people have deployed tech has been obviously kind of going off track for a while. And so I'm glad that he's raised the concern.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that spurred this conversation and a revisiting of the connection was one of our exchanges on Twitter or X or whatever we want to call it. It's from January 21st, and I was quote tweeting somebody, as I like to do because I'm a sadist and can't help myself. I need to start muting some of these people, but I just have a compulsion to, when somebody makes a really bold assertion, to respond or sometimes question it. And I had said something in response to a tweet that said schools love to say they're data driven. What this often means is that they're very good at focusing on numbers that excuse the outcomes that everyone can plainly see. And I responded and said, educators love to say they're evidence-driven. What this often means is that they're very good at focusing on evidence that justify the outcomes they think are the best and ignoring evidence to the contrary. Because one of the things that really, I think, is a big issue at play in our discourse, whether it's politics or education and certainly other things, is sort of a sense of tribalism and not really, I guess, putting tribe or party or whatever you want to focus on as the priority, and principles being maybe second or lower than that. And you had some responses. One of the things that you said, and I can link to this in the show notes if people want to go back and read all of it, but the thing that you said that really caught my attention was, and I quoted it and said, every digital interface has become more game-like. And I guess your assertion is that is really sort of pushing people to be a bit more tribal, or maybe you can sort of unpack that.
Well, I think it's I think the right way I think humans are tribal, and it's hard to kind of transcend that, right? And that's generally the thing that we're struggling against one way or another. As it relates to the technology comment, we're kind of inundated with data and trying to make sense of that data versus, if you were to go back 30 or 40 years, you wouldn't really have the same kind of data, right? And then along with that has been the kind of growth of gaming and things like that. But I think there's this kind of rise of thinking the data can tell you everything you need to know, and not really having us being able to separate yourself from what it says and use your own judgment in addition to whatever it says. Mm-hmm. And there's various interpretations of what data to pay attention to, right? What data matters, things like that. And there's not a lot of discussion of like whether we're really able to measure what truly matters and have that data drive us, right? So, and we were there's a thing that we were exploring between that in a previous thread was the terms data-driven versus data-informed. Mm-hmm. And the way I see the differences between those two things is that everybody's using data, but data-driven is when your judgment is fully defined by what the data tells you to do, right? You're in some ways subject to that data because you're not making independent decisions. And when you're data-informed, you can use the data, but you also can make independent decisions based on intuition, judgment, things like that. Mm-hmm. And there's a pretty meaningful difference there. And I think that difference is really, I think, what separates someone who might be more tribal and someone who's not.
Yeah. So again, several threads to pull on there, and sort of being, I think you said data driven, and what was the other data?
Data informed.
Informed, yeah. Cognitive science and science of learning, quote unquote. One of the things that I think somebody said, and I don't get it exactly right, but sort of evidence informed or empowered or some versions of that. And yeah, it does seem like it feels to me like there is a segment and a certain number of people who, and I'm going to just be very clumsy in trying to articulate this because I don't know how best to articulate it, but feels like when I respond with something, I almost can predict what the response will be. There's memes, sort of lines that folks from the cognitive science of learning side, and to be clear and fair, some progressive educators will they have their versions of it as well. And so, like, I guess is that what we're talking about here? Is this sort of lack of ability to think independently, or I don't know. I don't know if I'm making sense, or again, I profess I'm being clumsy about it because I'm trying to think about it out loud.
Well, so yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll be clumsy along with you. And by the way, I respect the way you engage with people and debate online, because you're willing to try to have constructive debate, even though you might anticipate that response or reaction. To me, the conversation about learning and knowledge that isn't being had is this kind of subject-object transformation, which to me is the essence of reflection, which is why as a company we even focus on reflection. So to me, there's what you know, and then there's the relationship to what you know, right? As kind of the two kind of assets of intelligence. And, and we're constantly in a battle between those two things, right? And if you go back, I can't remember who the philosopher was that came up with the statement, knowledge is power. I think it's kind of a flawed statement. Knowledge can be power, but knowledge can also have power over you. That subject-object relationship, right? So, and especially now where information is exploding and there's so much data that is around us, I think we're constantly grappling with this, where essentially the data kind of controls us. It makes us subject to it, and that's where you get those kind of automatic responses to it. And people haven't quite figured out how to separate their relationship with that information and view it with some independence and kind of see it as valuable for what it is, but maybe see its flaws in that kind of one-dimensional way of looking at it. So that to me is kind of it's a part of the debate just generally around human intelligence that's missing, and I think explains a lot of what we struggle with online and in a lot of places where you're essentially battling with people who are subject to the information that they have in their head.
So what's the angle, or let's unpack the gamer kind of thing. And I'm not a gamer. I mean, I used to play Atari when I was a kid, but I don't have much patience to sit around and play games. But there is a culture there, and there's a sort of gamification, I suppose, and I think that's what you're saying, to a lot of the things that we're doing. So how do you see that relationship or that dynamic at play in this dynamic?
I think there's a couple of things that gaming does to me, and it's not training you to look at things from different perspectives. It's training you to look at them through one kind of system or one perspective. And a lot of gaming is screen based, and that there's almost a visual component to that. But two, it's giving you kind of fixed rules and immediate feedback to progress through, right? So it's basically giving you the incentive to improve your scores and progress in that one experience, but not giving you an experience or an ability to separate yourself and to question whether those are the scores that you should be maximizing, right? And they're doing it for good reason, which is, clearly it builds some motivation to kind of perform, right? And that's of value. And I think it's sort of enjoyable because it reduces the complexity of the world, gives you the incentives that are fun to pursue, and you just want to kind of maximize your scores, right? But it trains you not to kind of stop and separate yourself and to question what you're doing, or to see the information around the experience in a way that helps you see it in a new light and a new perspective. And
so obviously if you're in video games, that's a gaming scenario, but in what ways, how would you describe, you're talking about every digital interface has become more game-like, whether it's social media or I don't know what the other digital interface is. I mean, this is a digital interface. Would you characterize this as more game-like, or what do you mean by that?
Well, I think there even is here, although maybe that one's not the one to examine most closely. But I don't know about you, but if I spend all day on Zoom and then I go talk to people in real life, there's an adjustment period. Because there's more things you can read from each other. There's more complexity in the experience, and thus it's a little bit different. But I think if you go to like a school setting and looking at assessment data, right? You're sitting on a computer or in a room with a group of people looking at assessment data. Your incentive is to make the scores go up, and of course you're talking about how to do that. But it's in a situation where maybe the complexity of the situation is reduced, and you think the data can tell you what to do, versus dealing with the greater complexity of reality of your students, your culture, whatever it might be that might get it there. Right. And so I think the data itself, in a school setting makes a school feel like a game to some degree. Right. And it makes it feel like, scores go up, I'm doing good, which to me is the experience of playing any game. Right. And kind of simplifies the perspectives that you take on how you guide your work.
Yeah. So I'm trying to sort of extrapolate this into the conversation or dialogue that I continue to try to have, and thank you for the kind words about how I try to do that. Sometimes I recognize that I'm not always successful, and sometimes more snarky than I want to be or should be. But I'm trying to have a dialogue and a dialectic, right? Trying to figure out, to me, that's what I'm after, is how do we figure out what's true and what's not true, and how do I change my mind as quickly as I can if I'm wrong, and what's the evidence for that? And sometimes that comes off as debate or argument, but for me, that's not generally what I'm trying to do. All that said, is so if I think about what you just described, I could make an analog to if we want to take the sort of more traditional explicit instruction, knowledge, important curriculum folks, instructional approach, is that it seems to me a sort of rigid, narrow focus on knowledge building and efficiency, and the data that you could get from students giving right answers and being correct and building that knowledge, but not as much of a recognition or a conversation about more complex learning. And so, for example, one of the things that I continue to sort of explore, and one might say argue, is the idea that we should always do, for novice learners, we should always do knowledge building before doing anything more complex or something more like inquiry or something like that, which I think generally is true, and some of the evidence and research shows, and I think that's good as a sort of heuristic. But once it gets into a sort of algorithm where it's this, then that, always and forever, then that starts to trouble me and bother me, because we can see exceptions, and it also doesn't seem to recognize that there might be a different set of rules or priorities, as I would say, academic priorities, that might be at play. And so we're talking inside this little box of how do we build knowledge so that then they can do something with it, ostensibly. But I'm saying, well, what about schools that have other academic priorities, and what if you used inquiry to sort of frame and set the scene and get students to think about the bigger picture, then sort of go to the micro before going back out to the macro? And to me, it feels like almost like we're sort of playing two different games. Does that make sense?
It does, for sure. And if you remember, I don't know if you remember from my background, but I came from design thinking, kind of design background, which to me are very close cousins to inquiry, and so to some degree, I'm very, very aligned with you from a background and ideas perspective that just focusing on test scores, for example, may not be the best thing. There are other goals at play. And one other thing I want to note within that kind of game experience that I want to make sure is noted is, I think testing and assessment has started to look more like a game to the student as well as to the teacher. And so there are these self-reinforcing loops that I think we're battling a little bit. Testing is done on computers, which is a very major shift that we don't really focus on too much as it relates to the data we look at, right? And even like formative assessment tools, if you look at them, some of them are very explicitly game-like, and they almost look like casino, like points and things like that they kind of bring into these experiences. And there's gamification loops going on and all those things, which I think affect, one, maybe drive engagement in a light way, which is why people do it, but also put kind of blinders on to these other goals that we're talking about. Right? And I think fundamentally what design and inquiry and, to some degree project-based learning do is very much about kind of stepping back and taking different perspectives on information and developing different relationships to it. Right? And this is the vector that I was talking about that, fundamentally is kind of where reflection comes in. And I think if we're not talking about this subject-object axis of intelligence, then we don't look at why that's even worth mixing in around, the knowledge-based approaches to education, which then get caught up in these gamification loops where you're just trying to optimize scores and that's it.
Yeah. So when you think about the idea of reflection and the data that you're I guess collecting in some sense with Swivl, is it data? Is it feedback? Or talk a little bit about what that process looks like, and what you call it, whether it's data or feedback or both or what.
It's some of both. They're all, so one of the big things that's different between us and maybe EdTech is we're trying to support teacher-led instruction versus driving screen-based instruction, right? And I think there's going to be a real fork in the road ahead between those two methods, and kind of the ones that believe in the gamification, I think, are going to go down the screen-based one, right? Because it's going to show tighter and tighter loops around narrower and narrower skills. Scores go up. It's going to continue to look good, right? I think a classroom inherently trains you to see the world in different perspectives from the teacher, from other students, including your own, and inherently has a kind of a reflective value to it, regardless of how the classroom is from, right? And so that alone is kind of why we make this investment in teacher-led and classroom-based instruction versus screen-based instruction, because I think it's going to empower students with more reflective thinking inherently. And then we're inserting ourselves around that to create either feedback or routines of thinking with feedback on that thinking that help enhance and take that to the next level. So like some examples are, I might, this device here behind me can give a teacher a tip in the moment on how to manage the class better, to help them think about how to approach it, or can give them a report at the end on how they could have handled a challenge better. And then for the students, you can send them an assignment for a talk-based reflection that gets them to talk out their experiences and kind of separate themselves from that experience, see it from a different perspective, and then come at that information in a new way. And each one of them, tries to score things like depth of understanding, or maybe they'll use a school's rubric for a best practice. But you're bringing both data, feedback, and an experience around the whole thing to promote not only knowledge, but relationships to knowledge that are growing in the classroom.
Yeah. So when, you've seen me for years sort of push and prod and whatever you again want to call it, the relationship between inquiry and explicit instruction, those kinds of things. What do you see, or how do you describe the ways in which sort of teaching and learning ideally could and should look like? Or is there an ideal? Are there ideals? I mean, from your perspective, especially when you think about people who you're looking to work with you on Swivl and the projects, and just, as we talk about preparing students for the modern world, what does that look like ideally for you? Because I mean, you tweet about explicitly instructing and teaching certain things, and I do as well. And I think knowledge is important. It's really, really important. Shouldn't be overlooked. But yeah, what is that relationship and sort of prioritization of those pieces in an instructional sequence look like for you?
I mean, so the big one that I feel like I'm going all in on, which maybe is the level beyond that, is trying to keep the structure of a classroom versus the screen being the medium of learning moving forward. Because I think that alone is preserves an important reflective capacity, or develops an important reflective capacity, right? Within that, I think there's lots of judgment calls, but I'm very much in the same camp as you. It can't all be knowledge and no inquiry or kind of project-based experiences wrapped around that. It has to be some mixture of the two. another, just an example of kind of where that's embodied in our tech is, this device can just passively observe a class and give feedback, but you can set it up in a corner and guide students through a discussion or a project based on whatever the teacher was just teaching, which solves a classroom problem because teachers can't be everywhere all at once, right? And that's kind of an inherent classroom challenge for teachers, but builds that bridge into shift from direct instruction to application in one form or another, which to me I think is essential to, again, like if the goal again is all around not just developing knowledge, but developing the right relationships to knowledge, that to me is essential to those things.
And then, so you're advocating for something that's less screen-based and more person-to-person humanity. I'm looking at some of the things that you've tweeted. Participating in reality now needs to be explicitly taught. Yeah, I mean, talk a little bit more about that. That's a curious statement to me.
It connects with what we're saying, and so I think a game is a simplified reality, right? There's less even if they claim to be a highly complex game, it is an experience designed to be paced exactly to your ability level. And what keeps you engaged versus what gets you disengaged, and to incentivize you with more simplistic rewards, right? And I think on its own, it's it's a great experience. Cool, play a game. There's nothing wrong with that. But then as all of your experiences turn into game-like experiences, that makes it where you're not trained to handle a variably paced world with more complex factors. Right, and so participating in the real world is kind of where that language comes from. But the ability to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't agree with you, right? That's not an experience that's paced ideally for you in your proximal zone of development, and that is giving you instant rewards for you mastering the next level, right? It's almost all the opposite. And if you're going to be able to do that, I think you have to train that at this point, because all of technology is training you for the other experience at this point. If we don't train people to actually live in reality, I don't think they'll be able to. And this gets down, like, of course, we're talking at a time where there's a lot of chaos about what life is going to be. But I'm starting to view it as kind of like a real fork in the future that you're creating for your kids, which is basically, are you educating and developing a mind to still be able to live in reality in some level as well as use technology? Or are they going to be wholly dependent on simulations to operate and function and live? Right. And so, like, we want to, in my view, you want to develop a mind so that they can handle a variably paced world with a lot of complexity and unclear rewards, at least some of the time. And we need to explicitly teach that.
So I think you've also shared some things and talked about differentiation and not differentiated instruction per se, but the ability or the importance, I guess the skill to differentiate yourself from others. And I think that's what came to mind as you were talking there, is one of the differentiators that you can have human experiences and that you don't. I mean, I was talking with my parents the other day, and we were talking about kids. My dad was making a joke about teenagers having, wanting to have sex. I said, actually, they don't want to have sex. They don't want to get out of their house. They don't want to drive. They don't want to do, so they're sort of trapping themselves in some ways inside this digital world and not that person to person kind of thing. But what do you mean, if it's that or more, when you talk about the importance of differentiating yourself?
Yeah, I think the term, I'll start with kind of where most people take that term in, and it applies to how you accommodate a learner in a learning experience.
Right.
And we were trying to use it, and I use it to a different definition that's used but less commonly understood, which is how it really is this subject-object shift and this relationship you form with information. It's how you shift your perspective, how you differentiate your perspective. The other term that's used interchangeably would be decentering, which is a Piaget term, right? But it's basically human development is this process of constant decentering or differentiation. And I think it really, how it happens is the interesting question, right? And I think the best answer I could muster in the moment is experiencing other people and other perspectives in sufficient density eventually leads you to start shifting your perspective as you grow and evolve, right? So, you start with a single perspective, yourself sort of solidifies to maybe when you're 8 or 7 or something like that, which is when you have, a perspective. And then from there, experiencing more people, more ways of viewing the world in different contexts is what leads you to, for one, reject most other people's perspectives because you don't want to be like them. But so at certain times, say, that's an interesting way of looking at that problem or of being or of existing and differentiating your thinking, right? And it's the other side of, if you think of differentiation is on the side of the educators, how to accommodate the learner, but differentiation from the learner's perspective is how do they change their perspective to kind of rise to the challenge or attack it in a new way, right? And so it's all within the same envelope of shifting your relationship to information or shifting your relationship to experience. And to me, it's kind of the essential thing we want to preserve and maybe even grow in this age of AI.
Well, that brings up, so one of the things that I'm increasingly passionate about, and I wish there were more people, I feel like I'm in an elevator of one when I talk about this, or very few, is the idea of enlightenment civics and, sort of regrowing, reestablishing classic liberal principles, which to me is essentially an inquiry project, right? It's the skepticism, empiricism of is that true? How is that true? How might that be true? How might that not be true? For who is that true? In what ways is that true? And what I have come to the term of objective pluralism, which is we have knowledge, kind of coming back to the knowledge. We have knowledge that is generally accepted because we have come to that through a process of empiricism and checking. It isn't that somebody gives us the knowledge. It's that collectively we have tested it, we have looked at it, and provisionally we accept that it is what we think is true, that the world is not flat, that it is indeed some sort of roundish thing. But it's always provisional, right? And distinguishing between that, and you use the word perspectives, and that's I think the right word, is that people have different perspectives on things. When we were going through the sort of quote unquote great awakening from 2020 into the next few years, is people had all kinds of perspectives and opinions, and some of them very, very valid, But to recognize that is not necessarily knowledge or true, right? That those things that they are asserting are important to listen to, and for a number of reasons. One, because those things we want to have the empathy to, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's interesting. I didn't realize that's why you voted for Trump. That makes a little more sense, or that you voted for Biden or whatever. But the other piece, the other reason that's important, is because when you have multiple perspectives and allow for those different voices at the table, then that's the way that you correct the knowledge that might be wrong. And without that, absent that, then we've got a problem because we can't self-correct. And the empirical process of enlightenment, civics, doesn't get applied. And so that's one of my concerns when we have such a narrow focus on knowledge and explicit instruction, and this idea, if I just explain it to them, if I just tell them, then they'll know it, they'll understand it, and go forward. But when we become adults, we're going to be faced with all kinds of open-ended challenges, and we're also going to need to figure out what is true and what is not true. And can we think about those other perspectives and judge them and think through them in a way that will help us to understand it more deeply, not just to know it. And I think knowledge is power is a flawed statement. I would say knowledge is power, understanding is actually real power, because we know what COVID is, but we didn't understand it, and it was a real problem. And I can give other examples. So yeah, I mean, again, not necessarily a question there, but just that idea of how do we to sort of reestablish and regrow those pieces of what I would say enlightenment civics and empiricism, and is it in your view, is it an inquiry move, or is it a knowledge move, or is it both, or is it something different?
I think it's I mean, I think it's been well proven. You got to know things to be able to understand things, and so no problems with a certain amount of emphasis of direct instruction and kind of that kind of education. But I'm also of the view, like you are, it's not all that. And I think if you look at, I'm also a fan of Enlightenment principles and feel like we're struggling to uphold them. And I think there's a direct relationship between what we're talking about between gaming, or you might also mix in the word personalization, and how it weakens someone's ability to decenter or differentiate and then participate in enlightenment principles, which sort of demand it. Right? So what is free speech? Well, it's the most effective mechanism to bring as many perspectives as possible on a problem, which when executed well makes us all better and creates progress and solves problems, right? Cool. I like that. But we can all see that there's been an erosion in ability to participate in that. I'll use the word participation again. And I think that can be directly tied to the single perspective experience that personalization in games reinforce, which means that people are less differentiated, less able to decenter their thinking in response to any new information. Not to say we've ever been perfect, right? Like, it's not like people couldn't disagree or they wouldn't disagree in the past and never see each other's perspective. But there are levels. And so what it comes down to is education has to take on and maintain that challenge of teaching kids and children how to differentiate their thinking, how to decenter themselves. And I don't think you can do that without some amount of inquiry or project-based or whatever it is that teaches you to build different kinds of relationships to the information. It's not enough just to be able to read with proficiency and the whole process. It has to be a richer experience. And I was going to dive into the way people talk about socialization, which I think is very reductive, but I want to kind of get off into a side topic there.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do that. I really want to not straw man or caricature the sort of more cognitive science of learning perspective, but sometimes what it feels like is at least the message that I get is, and I don't think they actually typically believe this, but and I think maybe it's a messaging problem, but it's like if I would just tell them about all of the different perspectives, then they would know about all the different perspectives and we're good. And that's a very different thing than getting them to think about those different perspectives and wonder about those different perspectives, and maybe I have to defend one of those different perspectives. My daughter is in elementary education pre-service, and she had a history class, and she was meant to debate something where she had to take the side of advocating for slavery. She said, "I don't want to do that." And I said, "Well, you better get over that pretty quickly, because you may not agree with that, but it's a good practice, right?" The other, the sort of more limited approach might be something like, this is what other people thought, and this is what these people thought. Explain it. Now, can you report that back to me? And now we're moving on. And so I guess it's sort of a weird fine line, right? Of like, how do we balance the amount of knowledge? And it is, I've said it before on podcasts, is that I'm fairly sympathetic to E.D. Hirsch's idea of having a shared cultural knowledge. I do think there's some real value to that. And when we all have sort of disparate knowledge and disparate sort of cultural kinds of practices, that can be a real source of friction and problem. And I think we're seeing some of that. but it's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So how do we move? And I'm not expecting you to have the answer to this, but if you have an answer, I'd be curious to hear it. How do we move education from something that is a little bit more rigid and narrow to something that's a bit more expansive, but not too far to where it's something like discovery learning? Because I'm also critical of people who say, well, they don't really need knowledge. They can Google it or chat GPT it or whatever. And teachers shouldn't really necessarily have to teach. Kids can figure it out on their own. So how do we sort of find that middle ground? And if you can also cure cancer, do that as well.
Well, as an aside on discovery, I think it's at this point being proven to be less effective. But I think a tiny fraction of students' education should be trying to figure it out on their own, right? Because that is an experience, which draws me back to kind of the answer that I'll give to your kind of your question, which is, I think there's what a perspective is and what a role is, I think, is more complex than we kind of give it credit for. So, a teacher themselves has a perspective and they can't change it. They can just be an experience for a student, and that a student can experience a teacher's perspective. Mm-hmm. And they can try to describe the intellectual differences between those things, but how much of that passes is up for discussion. And what it really comes down to is experiencing others' perspectives is how you learn how to shift your perspective. So many teachers, experiencing many students, experiencing different kinds of experiences in education, different roles that you're playing are really rare, where a lot of those perspective shifts come in. And so I think, like the foundations of knowledge are, I think can come from more specific experiences with a teacher and a group of students. But an education has to include essentially different role plays and different kinds of experiences where you're working together in such a way that you can experience both other people and information in different ways. And that's where that kind of decentering starts to come from. The reason why I say that, there's I've studied a lot of developmental theory around these things, right? Like I'd say the best one, it's really built up Piaget's foundings, but the best one, the most understandable one, is the constructive development framework from Keegan. And he goes through a long history of, one, how they came up with the theory, but two, what therapists and psychologists have tried to do to help shift people's perspectives and bring them up these developmental ladders. And it's pretty much a minefield of failed experiments, right? And no therapist in the role of a therapist could teach someone how to shift their perspective on what they feel like they're being controlled by. And it's the same problem with a teacher to a student. There's within the roles that they're playing, there's only so much you can do to get a kid to shift their perspective on information. They just need more experiences. And so that's why I say, to me, it comes down to education needs to have varied experiences to arrive at a kid who can actually shift their perspective and see things in different ways.
Yeah. So then what are you seeing with teachers and particularly in the use of Swivl and the reflective tools? Again, my daughter is a pre-service elementary education student, and I'm keenly interested in what she's learning and how she's learning and what she's, thinking about and those kinds of things. And of course, most teachers report that their teacher pre-service program wasn't very good. I think that's a perennial problem. I've started to wonder about, are we expecting different things or too much, or what our expectations are of teacher preparation? I thought maybe we're misunderstanding what that might or should do. But I am curious what you're seeing with teachers in terms of what they're coming out with, and then their reflective practice and how they're reacting to maybe some of the data and feedback that they might get from Swivl and those kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think the overwhelming thing that we see is the messy reality of classrooms isn't something teachers are prepared for. In particular, I think modern learners make that uniquely challenging because they don't engage or participate as well as students from 30 or whatever years ago. And so you can take whatever theory they're trained with, which is, could be fine theory, but the messy reality of kids and classrooms and the nuances of how to manage that is, I think, where a lot of teachers kind of really struggle, right? And there's lots of established data around kind of the rate at which teachers give up on their teaching profession, by year of profession. And if you make it through your fourth or fifth year, you have at least a chance of sticking around. But up until that, there's very high drop-off rates. I think that's only increased because I think it's just messier and harder than it was before. And so I think, I don't know how, like what we try to do is help them with that challenge by giving them more information and supports and feedback, because I think what most teachers feel is, they finish their training, they go into a room, they close the door, and they're on their own, right, in this kind of messy reality. And then they're being asked to do a lot of things that they're not sure how to execute for the students in front of them. And that's just, I think, some unresolved tension around the role and kind of what's expected of them in those roles.
Yeah, it's again, like the accusation or the criticism and complaint, at least one of them is that, they're not learning about cognitive load theory. They're not learning about, retrieval practice. They're not learning how learning works and, cognitive science. And that may or may not be true in some cases. I wonder if they're learning about it, but they're not using the same terminology. I've almost never encounter a teacher who says, "Oh yeah, I learned much about project-based learning in my pre-service program." So, the thing that I always sort of chuckle at is the sort of more traditional end of the spectrum. I always think they claim that the progressive end is hegemonic in our schools, and the progressive teachers claim the same thing. We've been lecturing and drilling, killing, and it's just, we need something that's more student-centered. But it is odd to me, like, as I'm thinking about my daughter going through the process, she's taking some education courses, but she's also taking a history. She's taking a women of religion. She's taking astronomy. So, I think one of the assumptions or misunderstandings or whatever it might be, that the idea that these pre-service teachers are in education courses from the moment they start their program to the end. And so clearly they should have plenty of time to dive into and really learn about all these things. And I'm not making a defense of teacher prep programs, but I think it's easy to cast them as villains, where maybe it is. They should be doing some thinking about different ways and approaches and making meaning of things, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Christian Moore Anderson. He and I have been back and forth on some different things. He's not on X anymore. He's got a new book that he's been working on. He asked me for some feedback on the idea of making meaning, and that to me is a very different process. And our pre-service teachers making meaning of some of these things and really thinking and reflecting on these things, as opposed to just being explained and being taught. And okay, so here's what this means. Here's what this means. Here's what this means. And then that sort of begs the questions. And Christian Moore Anderson talks about in his book, it's not out yet, but first order reality and second order reality. First order reality being, this is what the sort of teacher tells you it is. Second order reality is the way that what you make of that and how you think of it. And those two things might be very similar, but they're not exactly the same. And therein lies a distinction that makes a difference. And when I said that to somebody on X, they said, that sounds like gobbledygook. And I'm like, okay, so how do we move that conversation into that space that is a bit more meaning making? And again, I feel like I'm asking the same question, but it's just some of the things you said, spurred those thoughts.
Well, I saw that thread, and I wasn't sure how to respond even to the way that person responded. But that language to me is very relatable, and so for me, it's very obvious what you're saying. just to map what I've been saying so far, that the subject-object shift is the direct map of that, right? First, second order, basically. And meaning making is essentially how you make that shift. It's how you see things from a different perspective, and it almost directly interchangeable thinking, right? And so I think that those two theories align very, very well. And so it all makes sense to me. As it relates to those teachers going into the profession, I think there's kind of two things colliding that are making it extra difficult. So you also have teachers who have grown up in a highly personalized world, kind of gamified. Their education's been personalized and gamified. They have not made meaning out of the theories they're applying, and then they're getting put into the classroom, and in theory and practice are wildly divergent, right? And then it's not fun. It's incredibly challenging. You don't know how to operate. It's not paced ideally for you. The errors are constant, and you don't know how to handle them, right? So you've got, on one hand, you've got teachers coming in who essentially are less decentered or differentiated than they've been, which means they're less able to handle that complexity. And you've got learners who are entering a classroom who spent, it doesn't matter what age you're talking about, more time on screens than has ever been spent before, who also have not gone through other earlier developmental gates based on experiencing the world from different perspectives. There's quite a bit of research around kind of the loss of play and the impact on kids psychologically. And it has essentially the same role, which is role taking. And it teaches you how to start shifting your perspective at a young age in a way that an iPad doesn't when you're just trying to maximize your game scores, right? And so it could be a sixth grader coming into a classroom with a new teacher. Both of them have less, essentially meaning making to why they're there. And then it goes less well than we expect it to go, right?
Yeah.
And the temptation, this is the thing that I'm really concerned with, is going to be, don't even try, go to screen-based education, because that's not going to ask the learner to make shifts to get better, right? And well, I guess we won't have teachers, right? I'm sure you've looked at Alpha School and the idea that there's just guides, there's no teachers. And I think that's a grave mistake, because ultimately what a classroom, what these experiences in a school create are experiences that decenter or differentiate the students and the teachers, and that has value at a societal level and in their ability to participate in enlightenment, right? And I could very easily see a world where if we lose that capability, we lose free speech, we lose these kinds of things that we value, because people just can't participate in it, right? It's not what their minds are kind of wired to do.
Yeah. So it makes me think then perhaps one way to do this, or to think about this, is to give them the opportunity to learn about these different instructional approaches and theories, and cognitive load theory and what have you. But part of the problem is that they don't have any context, because they don't have a classroom. And you can get them into classrooms. You can do some observation. I'm an advocate for doing some student teaching while you're in pre-service, but that's a different podcast. Once you get in and hit the ground and have to actually teach, then that's a different beast. And now you have some context. And there you could and should have some reflective conversation to say, how did this work? What about this? Really start, applying those different pieces, whether it's cognitive load theory or retrieval, or like Vygotsky and ZPD and all this stuff, right? Because there you can start you have something to reflect it upon, right? There's a canvas, and you can make your painting, to make a terrible analogy. So it that's probably not going to happen, but that to me is one of the things that if we could get our schools to have, when I left the classroom in 2012, I felt like I didn't have the intellectual nourishment of the academic conversations. And honestly, it's one of the reasons why I love doing the podcast. It's not because I make any money off of it. It's not like I have a huge audience, but it's like, there's reflection, there's an exploration, there's making meaning. And so, can we get that into the schools? And, perhaps you're able to do some of that with Swivl and some of the conversations you have based on that.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, we're trying to do that, and of course, we're not trying to be prescriptive so much on the exact methods at the exact time, right? So if a school is a big believer in direct instruction, you can set up, in an admin portal on our tools, kind of the references that you want, and it'll guide your teachers to dutifully, do that with tips, real-time feedback, things like that. And one distinction there, that at the end of a teaching session, the teacher can actually talk with our software now and actually reflect out kind of what happened and how they can improve. So to some degree, we have that infrastructure there, and it's at a school level prompted by their chosen methods, right? Because we're not going to get into helping them of direct instruction versus inquiry. We're going to let those leaders and that locality make those decisions.
Right.
But we're kind of in that space where it's actually finally possible with the tech, with the right setup, where I can know the context of both what was done in the class by listening or visually observing, and the school's intentions from the methods and the curriculum they've picked and things like that. And so, plus or minus details, we're in that space where that's a way you can actually use AI to help teachers be better and to adapt their practices around whatever best practices that a school has decided is important to them.
So you have your Swivl has the ability to essentially have or give feedback and maybe a conversation. I don't know if that's taking it too far with AI to have some of those reflective conversations.
Yep. Yeah, it does. Yeah, we support them both in text and in voice. But yeah, generally speaking, gives you a chance to at the end, dialogue it out, ask questions, try to understand what happened, good or bad, based on the feedback it's generated on how things went, and kind of iterate it, right? And it does understand learning science, and so that's kind of infused in everything. But it's also really driven by whatever a school has chosen. They want their best practices to be based on.
That's fascinating, and I've looked at a couple of tools that have some similarities. There was an AI company, I don't even remember at this point. I had a conversation with them about doing something that was similar, and it just didn't seem like it was ready for prime time. I'm wondering how, because I think about AI. You've got AI music now, you've got AI writing, and I heard somebody on a podcast talking about, would you listen to AI music? And they said that they generally wouldn't. And I thought, well, it seems like there'd be an important distinction. I might have AI music on in the background, but if I really want to, engage in, really getting into the music and thinking and the thoughts that it provokes, then something that is human made is more likely, in my opinion, if for no other reason that my uptake on it, right? If I know it's not a person, for some reason, I think I'm much less likely to engage. Are you seeing teachers struggle with that tension of engaging with a non-human agent?
Not in this application. I share the sentiment with you. I like human music and art, and pick that every time. But that's when I have the choice between one and the other, right? And there's really no trade-off between the two. And I think the experience of a teacher is there isn't someone that they trust to talk to or available, right? Schools are overscheduled. There's not time, even if they have someone they trust to really set up meaningful time to examine each other's practice. Like it's a real struggle.
Right.
They don't always trust their coaches. They don't always trust their administrators. Understandably, just organizational behaviors, and so it's hard for them to. There isn't really an outlet where you can say, like, I could choose AI or a really trusting human. It's between nothing and AI, right? And in that case, if it can be a helpful partner, I think what we're seeing is it's a very very valuable thing as teachers can get into it and clarify their understandings and think better about their work. So I think that to me kind of matches the best way to use AI, which is to solve the problems humans can't solve instead of replace them, right? It's not replacing a coach, it's not replacing an admin. They still need to play a role, but it's filling in for what they can't do and expanding what they can do in a way that's really meaningful for both sides.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you if you're bullish or bearish on AI, and it sounds like you're bullish. But I imagine there's probably some qualifications and ways in which you would maybe be a little less hesitant. How do you think about the use of AI, essentially in education, just in general?
I think AI is very paradoxical. I think it's simultaneously good and quite negative at the same time, and and a lot of it comes down to how you choose to use it, which is part of this idea of like you need to be able to decenter yourself to know when it's appropriate and when it's not. Separate yourself from what it's telling you, and have some independence of thought, because I think the same trap is going to be here with AI as there was with kind of the last wave, which is data, being data driven. Now you're going to be AI driven. Modern framework. And so to me, like, there's going to be a lot of times using AI makes sense. There's going to be a bunch of times when it doesn't, and knowing when it is one versus the other is the hard part. And that, to me, I actually think is one of the goals education needs to take on, is to educate humans that know how to do that. And then also in how you choose to use it as an adult, I think there has to always be an examination of, is this the right thing? Is this not appropriate? Am I using it constructively? And so to me, it's a really rich paradox, and I'm simultaneously terrified of some things and excited things. I don't know if that matches your feelings about it, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the danger in education is if you have AI that's doing the thinking for you, then you're not doing the thinking. And I think I think Daniel Willingham is right that, memory is the residue of thought. And if we want to tie memory into knowledge and making meaning, I mean, it's all there, right? And if you have AI doing the thinking for you, then you're not doing the thinking. You're not lifting the weights. Your muscles aren't growing, your intellectual muscles and that kind of thing. It's interesting. I was, my daughter working on things in college, and, the temptation of using AI to have it write things and that kind of stuff. And so is it a good use to have AI summarize a document for you to help you think about it? And one might say, well, that's not good, because then you're not doing the thinking, or you're doing less of the thinking. But then I thought, how is that different from Cliff Notes? We had, for people who are not long in the tooth like some of us, Cliff Notes were books that you could that would give you a sort of summary of big books. And of course, it wasn't on everything. AI can tell you, so you can upload things and summarize it. So it's a little bit different, but yeah, it's a real challenge. And I thought it was interesting. Jared Cooney Horvath mentioned that he thinks AI is going to get worse in terms of the results that it will give us. And I think there is an interesting argument there, especially because if it's training itself on what we're giving it, and it's also creating slop, and if you feed slop into something, you're likely to get slop and all those kinds of things. And we've got an AI PBL design tool that I think is really a very useful tool. Otherwise, we wouldn't offer it as a sort of thought partner. But I think the advantage there, or the opportunity, is to say, all right, let me have it serve as a thought partner, right? Can it give me some ideation, some an outline and a framework that then I can say, okay, does this work? Does it achieve the goals that I want it to achieve? Does this meet the needs of my students and the teaching that I want to do? Which means that you have to know all of those things, but it also means you have to take that time, right? So it's not necessarily any different. If somebody gives you something off of Teachers Pay or you buy something off of Teachers Pay Teachers, is it good? And lots of times it may not be. And so that could be a real problem. In addition to all the other problems. But the upside is that if you have it create a project for you, or give you some ideas, then you can take the next step and really go into much more depth and do more things with it. It could be a real tool to have conversation and say, let's have a reflective conversation about this with teachers, and say, what are the things that we want to look for to make sure that this is in what we want as far as a quality, well-designed project, and then can we take it and implement it? Is it critical thinking that one of the questions I want to ask you is how you think about critical thinking, and to me, the way that you decide, you're talking about discernment of the results that AI is giving you. To me, that's a critical thinking process, and this is one of the things that I have been exploring recently. I'm curious how you think about it. Is the idea from cognitive science is that critical thinking is domain specific, which to me, I hear that and say, okay, that makes some sense. If I'm a scientist, there are certain tools and processes that I might use in a critical thinking sense that don't transfer to engineering or whatever, a different domain. To me, there is also a generalized sort of critical thinking skills, or maybe it's habits of mind. Maybe it's something different. I don't know what we need to call it. I'm fine calling it critical thinking, but that doesn't seem to work with some folks.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, how do you think about that?
It has become complicated. I would have been fine with calling it critical thinking too, but I see the same debates where it's getting a little bit fraught. I think the thing that's missed in that debate is kind of your relationship to yourself, right? And your ability to not only think, but think about your thinking and separate your thinking from other needs, other impulses, other relationships you might have to information or people, right?
Right.
And that's the generalizable version, is to be able to separate yourself from yourself, see it from a different perspective, decide, whether that's appropriate or not, right? And that to me is it's not an innate human skill. It's something that's developed, right? You're not born with the ability to separate your thinking from your thinking. They've pretty well established that, at least historically, it didn't start to happen until you're in about high school. But I actually think that was with a very stable societal structure. And I think the reality is it is something we develop through experience. And if we change the experience of society, it may develop later, it may develop earlier, it may never develop, right? And so the thing we're playing with here is like, ultimately you need to be reflective. You need to be able to think about your thinking in order to use it appropriately for yourself and for other people. And you don't, that's kind of the essence of being effective with AI is being able to not be driven by it, but to be informed by it, right? Or to have second order understanding. I mean, all these things are really relatable, I think.
Empowered.
Yeah, and you could argue the right definition of critical thinking is one that fits all those things, which is you've made meaning of it, you've turned it into an object, you can separate yourself and see it from another perspective and decide whether it's appropriate or not.
Yeah, and you use the term developed, which I appreciate, because the people will say, well, critical thinking is not something you can teach. I'm not sure I agree with that. But that it's I think biologically primary, according to Geary's theory, biologically and secondary primary. If it's secondary, then you can teach it. But I think that misses the distinction of that even if it's not teachable, it's learnable, obviously, because people learn how to do it, and some are better than others.
Yes.
And so if it's learnable, it may or may not be teachable, but it's learnable. So how do we create the conditions under which people learn and develop those skills? And therein lies, one of the things that I think the sort of science of learning, quote unquote, folks tend to not really talk about very much. And partly because it's not easily measurable, and partly because I think it crystallizes over time. But I don't have any evidence to prove that. And so I get dismissed, and that's fine. That's part of the conversation.
Well, just to put a frame around that to maybe be helpful, right? Like to me, there's a question of whether intelligence is entirely measurable or computable, or if there's an uncomputable dimension, right? And this idea of second order, subject-object transformation, to me, is the domain of uncomputable intelligence. And so, you're trying to debate about the existence of it when they're arguing it doesn't exist, right?
Right.
And it's really important in a time when we're essentially automating certain aspects of intelligence, right? The computable side of it. I think it goes right at the question of are we going to be relevant moving forward? Is there something that can't be computed or not? And I think there is, and I think it's worth investing in. But I also think, to your point, it is something, I don't know if it's teachable, but it is learnable. And I think it's learnable through certain kinds of experiences. There's I'll end, I know we're running out of time, but I'll end with an interesting reference as a teaser for this. Did you ever watch the TV show Westworld?
Yeah. I actually want to rewatch it because there's some really interesting things that I think in reflection would right. Yeah, but it's expensive.
It is expensive. Did you ever read about the theory behind it that inspired this story?
I don't think so.
Okay, there's a writer named Julian Jaynes, and he wrote this book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. He was a researcher and a psychologist. He studied schizophrenia, but he was also a linguist, and he went through kind of the deep written histories of ancient Greece and Egypt, and kind of came up with this theory that essentially reflective thinking and the self didn't actually emerge until around the time of ancient Greece. And before that, a different state of mind existed, which was the bicameral mind. And the bicameral mind is embodied in this Westworld story of, essentially robots becoming sentient, and that was kind of the transition that they're telling the story around. But if this, he had the way he kind of discerned his theories was looking at kind of the earliest texts, which essentially had no self-narrative contained in them, and everything was explained through the actions of the gods, to later texts that transitioned to an I, a self-narrative as to explain action and thought. Right? It showed that there was something that happened in that time frame, an experience that ignited this new kind of thinking, which might be kind of the birth of uncomputable intelligence versus computable intelligence. And that, you could go and examine what was happening then, whether it was, the density of people and their socialization. It could be the arrival of reading and writing, and those are things that all were occurring at that time frame. But and it's hard to know which one came first, the thinking or the writing or the thinking, whatever it is. But basically speaking, there's a theory that it occurred, that experience is what creates it, and we haven't quite named it or figured out what creates it reliably, right? And we're still struggling with that to this day.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And yeah, I'm mindful of time, so I want to wrap us up here. But yeah, if anybody has a free version of Westworld, I'd love to rewatch it, because some really interesting, especially as AI has developed, it has resurfaced some of the thoughts of consciousness and ethics and all kinds of things. So, Swivl.com, SWI, you tell me, because I don't want to get it wrong. And where else should people find you?
Yeah, Swivl.com is great. There's just no E in the URL, so Swivl without an E. That's a great place to find me.
Okay, and I know you're on X. If you want to mention that or any other places, it's wonderful place for intellectual discourse these days.
Yeah, and like I said, I respect the way you approach it, and you do it, the way you try to kind of challenge people. I think it's necessary to get discussion going there, and I see the utility of doing that. So I appreciate that you're out there fighting a good fight and trying to get some good discussion going. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, well, sometimes much more successfully than others, but thank you. Well, it's been 9 years since we last talked, and let's not make it another 9. So thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.